All right. It is the week of July 24th, 2023, and this is the Fight Business Podcast. I'm Rose Patrick Auger, and we have a lot to catch up on, including the official announcement of Francis Ngannou versus Tyson Fury. Huge news, obviously, that came out a couple weeks ago, and we have to break it down for multiple reasons. We have to talk about how this came to be, why I called this months and months ago, might be a year or more now, where I said that this was probably going to be Ngannou's next fight. And people were like, what? Here we are, folks. I will tell you why I came to that conclusion, why I believe this happened. We'll also talk about if other MMA fighters can kind of use this as a blueprint or roadmap to leverage their free agency for big fights like this in the future. And is this good or bad business for both boxing and MMA, right? You have the UFC lineal heavyweight champion, the at the time consensus number one MMA heavyweight, going up against the lineal heavyweight boxing champion, consensus number one heavyweight boxer. Huge deal for so many reasons. We're going to break it down. We're going to lead with that. Then we're going to talk about comments that Disney CEO Bob Iger made to CNBC regarding bringing on a strategic partner for ESPN and how it could affect the UFC's next media rights deal. Very interesting comments made by Bob Iger, especially with the UFC and WWE rolling off into one company that's TKO, at least on the stock ticker. This could have big ramifications. So we have to dive into that and take a broad look at how Disney is doing, how the greater macroeconomic environment that I've been talking about for a while, shifting. It's starting to shift, folks. That's why we're here. We need to take a look at that. It's going to be a pretty in-depth, high business conversation. So get ready to nerd out with me. Then we're going to do quick hits. And last but not least, we're going to talk about an interview that Dana White did with Forbes. Some interesting tidbits came out of this interview, some interesting infographics talking about money that was made by the UFC, etc. And if you read in between the lines, there are some kind of nuggets there talking about how and where the UFC is going to go strategy-wise in the next coming years. So we're going to break that down as well. Timestamps at the bottom as always, and let's go ahead and dive right in. So first up, we need to talk about the giant announcement, which I'm sure you've been talking about for a couple weeks. Again, it's been a while since we've got one of these out. But Francis Ngannou is going to fight Tyson Fury. That's massive in so many ways. If you said that Ngannou dropped the ball by leaving the UFC, whether you're a fighter, a fan, a media pundit, you are eating so much crow right now, it's not even funny. This man left the UFC on a contract that was $500,000 per fight, and he got offered more than that. Don't get me wrong, right, for his re-up, but left that contract to sign an MMA deal with PFL, which is pretty lucrative. And then, as confirmed by multiple journalists and Jake Paul, of all people, getting an 10-figure contract. Or I'm sorry, 8-figure. No, at least $10 million, not 10 figures. That would be a whole different scenario. 8-figure contract for fighting Tyson Fury, one fight. If you watch the MMA Hour interview with his former agent, Markel Martin, Martin goes on to state this is, more money than he's made in the entirety of his UFC career in one fight, which it always was going to be, right? Like that's the base purse, depending on how pay-per-views do, which we'll get into here in a second. I mean, he's going to make so much money from one particular fight. Same thing that happened to Conor fighting Floyd, right? Set him for life, set his kids for life, all of that from one fight. Conor was making money no matter what, don't get me wrong, but that Floyd fight, this is Ngannou's Floyd fight. And I called this a long, long time ago. I said once leading up to the fight with Cyril Gane, but then once he beat Cyril Gane, I said Ngannou's not coming back to the UFC. He's going to go box. Maybe he comes back to the UFC afterwards, but I didn't think the UFC was going to give him the deal that he wanted to go box and do other things. and they didn't, obviously, but he was always going to box next. It made too much sense. It was too lucrative for him. And people were saying, well, he'd have to fight this heavyweight or all this. Like, no, he doesn't. Well, the reason I called this so long ago is the same reason this fight is actually happening. This is going to be an extremely lucrative fight for all parties involved. Is it going to be Conor versus Floyd? No. Not going to be at that level. Of course not. Is it going to be the next best thing you can get at heavyweight? Yes, 100%. And yeah, we've seen boxers come into MMA way back in the day, all that stuff, blah, blah, blah. But you have a current market environment right now where we've watched Jake Paul box multiple UFC veterans who are past their prime or never really should have been in their boxing, like Ben Askren, and get a good amount of outside investment, a large viewing audience, essentially build a career off of fighting former UFC veterans, right? And we know we've watched Paul fight, Tommy Fury, which is Tyson's younger brother, and lose that and all that stuff, right? Okay. But he has made a ton of money off of fighting former UFC veterans. I think he'll get his biggest payday when he fights Nate Diaz, which is coming up in just a couple weeks. Right? This is the time. There is clearly a market for it. He has kind of busted that door open for these freak show boxing fights, if you want to call it that. Whatever, so celebrity boxing, whatever you want to call it that. You need to strike while the iron's hot, while the market is there. There's going to be a ton of crossover from MMA fans who normally don't watch boxing, who are going to buy this pay-per-view. You're going to have a ton of casual fans get roped in by the video package that is going to show Ngannou just knocking people's heads off, right? You're going to see Alistair Overeem's head snap back 20,000 times. And this is also the safest bet and most lucrative option for Fury. I know, right? And I'm not a huge boxing expert. I'm not a boxing expert at all. And I'm not even a massive boxing fan. I watch a lot of the big fights. I enjoy boxing to an extent. I just can't keep up with everything given the craziness of my life. But in the boxing world, I've heard multiple times, and correct me in the comments if I'm wrong on this, because I could be. And if I am, call me out on it. But I've heard from anecdotally and from pundits online, right, that Usyk versus Fury, which would have been the logical, unify the titles matchup, so to speak. A lot of people were already writing off Usyk. And that's not to say they should, right? But Usyk is smaller. He moved up, beat Joshua, all that stuff. And, they essentially were writing him off that, oh, Fury's going to crush him. Look, saw how the fight went. Still would be an exciting fight. Still would be a big deal to unify all of the belts again, of course. But it seemed like it would have been a mismatch in several people's eyes already, which doesn't have the same excitement as Fury versus Ngannou towards the casual fan, right? Now, if you are a diehard boxing fan, you are almost certainly writing off Ngannou far more than Usyk, and that's completely understandable. But to the casual viewer, right, you're going to see power in Ngannou. I'm sure they're going to talk about, Wilder hurting Fury in their first fight and it going to a draw, and how Fury made that insane, stand up after it looked like he was gone. And they're going to play that up. They're going to say, look, we know Fury has eaten big shots before and been knocked down. Ngannou hits as hard as a Ford Escort, right? And is the biggest power puncher MMA has to offer. He's knocking people's heads off left and right. This could easily happen to Fury. Ngannou could win, right? That's the narrative they're going to push. I'm not saying that's what's going to happen. I'm not saying that's where you put money and all that stuff, but that's what they're going to push. It's going to be a lot like Floyd Mayweather, Conor McGregor. The amount of people that ate up, casual fans that ate up the notion that Conor McGregor could be the person to beat Floyd was insane, right? I believe the betting odds went as low as -300 for Mayweather at one point, which was just mind-boggling to anybody that followed Floyd's career. But there was enough fervor, there was enough crossover. People were all about it. Casuals drove that down, and you obviously had massive numbers. Everybody made a ton of money. Ngannou's going to walk away here with 8 figures minimum, plus pay-per-views, which are definitely going to be high. This was the smartest business move for all involved. That's why this is happening. Now, can another MMA fighter take this route, right? Could John Jones do this? Probably not. And there are many reasons why for Jones in particular, but let's say you get another Ngannou type 10 years from now, you get another, Fury type in boxing, or another Floyd Conor situation, what have you, 10 years down the line. The UFC is almost certainly going to do everything they can to block this now, right? John Nash pointed out that when it came to UFC contracts, there was a sunset clause added that essentially made it like, hey, 5 years from now, once you sign this, no matter what happens, you can walk away. And that's what Ngannou used to walk away from the UFC, as long as he didn't re-sign and all of that. They've essentially gotten rid of that. They found a way around that. It's much harder to leave and do other things now. They've kind of closed that loophole. There are a couple reasons why that clause was probably put in originally, right? You had the purchase of the UFC by Endeavor. You had more intense scrutiny regarding the lawsuit and class certification. So it was probably a CYA, especially in case they had to go to court quickly. That's still in the middle of nowhere, where the plaintiffs are really everybody's asking, like, let's actually set a court date. This is ridiculous. All the other cases you were waiting on for class certification, they're done. Let's move this along, Judge Boulware. It's just not going anywhere. It's insanity. Endeavor probably feels better about this to an extent now, right? Okay, we've owned the company for a while now. Less of a liability legally, where we've got certain things in place. Let's go ahead and do this. You have other MMA promotions starting to make splashes, like PFL doing what they're doing. That helps their antitrust case. They will point to that. And so they've kind of getting, overhauled those contracts again and made it much harder for people to get out of them the way that Ngannou did. Now, you still have a batch of fighters that if they didn't sign new contracts or re-up with the UFC from around 2017, they are going to be free like Ngannou, right? Whenever this contract change was made, which we don't know the exact time, if you sign that 5-year contract and you haven't signed a new contract, you're going to be allowed to kind of walk away. Nate Diaz, right, essentially is doing that. That's why he's going to box Jake Paul. Like, that's how he did that as well. But I think the UFC saw the danger in this and has made those adjustments. And with that, it's going to be a lot harder for another fighter to follow this roadmap. If the court case moves along, if some other pressure comes along that causes the UFC to have to go back to their 5-year sunset clauses or some type of sunset clauses, that opens the door. But right now, as far as we know, that door is pretty much shut again. And doesn't matter who you are, it's going to be increasingly hard to get out of your contract and, go take a big fight where you'll be able to do it without UFC's blessing. So that limits it. Can other MMA fighters do this? Yes. I mean, if you're, Bellator champ or PFL, sure. But, or at least probably, I can't say for sure, but you're not going to be able to garner the same reaction and fan base, right? It's super hard to reproduce what Ngannou is doing without being in the UFC just because of the audience and branding. That's just the way it works. MMA fandom does not translate equally across promotions, as we know. So I think the door is, at least for now, shut on someone following this as a roadmap. Is this good or bad for business when it comes to boxing and MMA? Well, for MMA, I think in a lot of ways it's good because it shows, at least from the fighter's standpoint, right? There was a path out, and there could be again, that could yield better results. It should hypothetically, from the fighter perspective, also signal like, hey, I just saw what Francis did. He was the heavyweight champ. He's now getting to box Tyson Fury and making ungodly amounts of money. Maybe I should try and negotiate harder in the UFC, or maybe the UFC isn't the best option because I could hypothetically get big in one or in PFL or Bellator and then leverage that for a big boxing fight. So if I'm going after this for money, right? And it's not all about reputation, which is still a huge part of why a lot of fighters do this. But if it's not all about that, right? Or if I end up being a free agent where we, don't renegotiate, but I've got some star power in the UFC and I'm able to kind of go do something else, that could be used as leverage against the promotion. It should also force the promotions to, yes, you have the UFC closing the sunset clause, or at least, making it harder, but it should also force the promotions to be more competitive in their offerings to fighters and to push certain fighters more, one would hope, right? You want to keep your stars happy. Now, we've talked about, and we'll talk about it later during the Dana White strategy talk, but we've discussed how once the UFC went from the variable revenue model to kind of the fixed revenue model with media rights, stars weren't as important. They didn't care about them as much. Do you still want to have stars to sell your pay-per-views to get more money based on your profit sharing split and to make your distribution partner ESPN happy? Of course. You still want to push certain narratives to go into new markets, right? Have stars like Wei Li, if you're trying to break into China, have Habib doing, Dagestan. Their most recent push has been the push into Mexico with Brandon Moreno, Alexa Grasso, Yair, right? Yeah, of course you still want that. There's still so many advantages to having stars, but it's now no longer required. It's not literally the lifeblood of your company if you're the UFC. Still is for PFL and Bellator and other MMA promotions, but when it comes to UFC, well, we don't have to worry about it anymore. We have this insane media rights deal that accounts for pretty much all of our revenue. So it was much easier to let bigger names go, not worry about free agency fights, all of that. With this, though, this is a true substitute that's a threat to the UFC because without any stars, right, that's when things can become an issue. Remember, as we talked about before, the UFC is entering that maturity phase of their company growth cycle, right? They're out of the startup and growth phase where it's all about growth. They're somewhere between growth and maturity and kind of transitioning. Growth is everything to companies. That's just how it always is. That's why things change all the time. I did the whole discussion about that before. Keeping your investors happy as a publicly traded company, keeping your stockholders happy, your board members, all that stuff happy is all about finding new ways to generate revenue, to continue growth or maintain growth while exploring new products, services, etc. And this could undercut that to some degree, because if you lose all of your stars and you start to lose the branding and brand reputation that the UFC has built up, which is really what they're running on right now, right? Especially with some of the cards we've had, the fight nights, where it's been like, wow, these are almost all Dana White Contender Series people, a lot of not ranked people. or who is this, unless you're a diehard, really following everything type person. They are running off of their brand power, where they say, we have the best fighters in the world, we're the top brand, and it is still very believable, especially to the casual viewer, right? That 8 segment of customer the UFC has talked about, at least 6 of them near 100% believe UFC is the top promotion. Wouldn't be surprised if most of the diehard segment also believes that too, right? It's hard not to when you look at the full depth of the rosters. But if they start to lose that if that starts to erode, even though it won't kill them by any means, it could hurt them as they're negotiating their new media rights deal. It could hurt them through ratings and viewership in that regard. Because even if you've got the best trends in the world, if they start to trend down, that's going to hurt your negotiations. What I talked about with Apple, they announced they were the most profitable company in the entire existence of humanity, but it missed Wall Street expectations and they lost money. Their stock price dropped. Shouldn't happen, right? But that's just how it works. And so if you show even a slight dip in UFC's EBITDA or any downward trend in terms of viewership, and it's hard because with cable dying and ESPN's whole issues, which we'll get into, you expect to see downward trends. But if there's a bigger dip than analysts expect or certain investors and fans expect, that's going to hurt you. That's going to hurt Endeavor's stock price. That's going to end up hurting the UFC, right? Because also, make no mistake, even though the UFC is now its own spin-off company with WWE, Endeavor still owns 51% of it. It's essentially back to what we were before Endeavor bought out the rest of KKR and Silver Lake shares. They're still the owners. It's just off in its own subsidiary now, right? So this could become a minor problem for the UFC, right? If fighters kept doing this, could easily become a problem. You would imagine the UFC will want to fight that in small ways, but albeit, make some of their bigger stars happy. Izzy, Jones, all that stuff, right? Jones re-upped and got the largest contract, or one of the largest, not the largest contract, but one of the largest contracts in history, his agent talked about. They'll keep doing that because they'll want to keep those guys happy and they'll want to keep working maybe a little bit harder than they have been to build some stars. So that should be good for the sport as a whole, right? But ultimately, what I hope happens in the MMA space anyway, and why I think this is good for business, is it should force all promotions to look into these options, right? If you're PFL, this is a goldmine for you right now. It is maybe your big break to push PFL to the next level. If you're Bellator, you're looking at okay, yeah, this is a big deal. And if you're one, you're looking at this as a possible roadmap to pulling bigger names away from the UFC, which, rising tide lifts all boats, right? If those promotions start to eat away at the UFC market share, it should hypothetically make everything better for the fighters and should force those promotions to become more adaptable, innovate in new ways that as a consumer should make you happy, right? This is the theory of capitalism, but obviously its actual execution could be different. But overall, for MMA, I think this is good for business. For boxing, I think this is bad for business from a more outsider perspective. And the reason why is pretty straightforward, right? You had a chance to have a big moment in your sport with the unification of the titles, right? If Fury fights Usyk, unifies the titles, that's huge in a lot of ways. Something that was talked about, when Anthony Joshua was going around and collecting belts, and when Fury came back and beat Wilder, all, pretty huge all around. So that would have been a big deal. You also now have, again, the equivalent of a freak show fight that's officially a sanctioned bout, right? The WBC has sanctioned this as an actual boxing fight. I think that's where this is bad for business, because that just makes your sport look pretty bad, right? MMA is MMA and is kind of the ugly stepchild of combat sports in terms of, it's not ugly. Maybe I don't even know what to call it. But the way MMA has been run for quite some time has always been kind of more of a circus, right? You had CM Punk come in, you had the Jose Canseco and a whole bunch of people come in the earlier days. But it wasn't necessarily out of the realm to do freak show fights, and it didn't hurt the sport because it was like, yeah, that's something MMA and the UFC would do, right? Bring in CM Punk to fight two guys that, again, was just bad to watch him fight. And White even admitted, yeah, we shouldn't have done that. It's done. We're not doing that again, etc. But I mean, it gave him a lot of money, especially the first time, right? That first pay-per-view buys, I think there were 800K, and you had Stipe versus Overeem headlining. It was definitely mostly because of CM Punk. And it got people's attention. Nothing unexpected there, especially when White talks about Zuckerberg versus Musk and how they would love to promote that fight, etc. In boxing, it tends to be a little bit more, I don't even know what the word is, more serious in some ways, right? They are more akin to the NFL, NBA, etc., at least in terms of some of the formalities, some of the things they try to do. Obviously, again, I'm not an expert, and you could argue with all of the fights they put together based on all the different belts. There's some, but at least try to keep up the appearance of, hey, this is a formal body doing a formal thing, etc. There should be a body that essentially says, like, no, this fight is not, we're not going to allow this as an officially sanctioned fight. You're going to do it as an exhibition? Sure, right? Exhibitions happen all the time. That's what Floyd's doing over there. Great. That's fine. That's what you did for Conor versus Floyd. Or no, I believe that was actually a fight, a professional fight. Apologize. But I mean, like, again, that was one of those things where it wasn't great, right? But it was also kind of, okay. This is a scenario where Floyd was not, for example, going to fight and possibly unify titles when he went and fought Conor. Fury had been talking about doing that. If Fury had been gone doing exhibitions, had retired, and then said, you know what, I'll come back out and fight. Yeah, sure. It's great. And again, I am not upset about the fight happening. I think the fight happening makes a lot of sense. I think it's great in terms of getting more eyes on the sport of boxing, etc. But where it's bad for business, the specific aspect that is bad for business is this shouldn't be a pro boxing fight necessarily with your heavyweight champion who, yeah. I think this fight should happen. I just think it should have been an exhibition in a lot of ways. That's my thought. If I'm wrong there, feel free to call me out. But that's where, again, it's bad for business, right? It's not my personal opinion. I can see that doesn't paint boxing in a great light. I can see why a lot of promoters are upset, etc. I think it should have been made. Just I don't know about that. So, at least from a business perspective. But again, that all being said, it is bad for business in the slightest of ways. That is the caveat, right? It is not this is going to shake things up and be terrible. Like, no, this is the fight that should have been made. It's just doesn't look that great when you've got your heavyweight champion essentially taking a boxing fight, not for the title, against a brand new guy when he could have fought Usyk. That's where it becomes kind of a, okay. Because you've got these formal bodies that are supposed to be independent, etc., right? That hold the titles. It's just one of those things. But it is good for business in boxing because it will draw a lot of eyes, right? And you will have a lot of crossover. You could easily have a fair amount of MMA fans start to become boxing fans because you'll have casual boxing viewers tuning into this, which is always good for any sport. So it kind of offsets each other in a lot of ways. But how much we'll see, right? We'll see what these pay-per-view numbers do. We'll see how big it is. If they get, several 100,000, let's say they get 400 or 500K pay-per-view buys, that's a win for boxing. Then it becomes good business. If they get close to 1 million, which I don't think will happen, then forget everything I said about the bad for business part in the appearance, because that's clearly a win because you have a brand new audience and market looking into your product. And that's ultimately always best for business, right? The farther you can market, the more people you can get to view your product, even if they don't end up converting, doesn't matter. You open up your funnel to a larger audience. As long as the conversion rate is at least there and it's not zero, you now have new consumers. You have new potential partnerships and sponsorships. It's always a win for business. So that's how I view those things. Overall, to wrap this up, because I know I've been went on a couple tangents here, but I thought it was important to cover all this. Overall, I think this was the right fight to make, and this was inevitable, right? This is why I called this so long ago. Let me know your thoughts on this. Let me know if you think there are paths for MMA fighters to follow this route, and if you think it's good or bad for business for one or both. If you like the fight, you don't like it, let me know. But it's nice to see it happen. Nice to call this. And yeah, I'm excited to watch this fight. Not going to lie. So, all right. So next up, we need to talk about comments that Disney CEO Bob Iger made to CNBC regarding bringing on a strategic partner for ESPN. To lay the groundwork and background for this, we need to talk a bit about how Iger, again, is in his second stint as Disney CEO after essentially a late night coup of his handpicked successor, Bob Chapek, which was a big shock to everyone involved, but made shareholders, board members, etc., pretty much everyone involved with Disney happy, from reports anyway. And recently, Iger's contract was extended for 2 years through, I believe, 2026. So those are some important keynotes here. Another thing to keep in mind with these comments is that Disney has not had the happiest of times lately in the market, right? Been forced to do a fair amount of cuts, especially due to a activist investor trying to, vie for a board seat. Iger was able to stop that from happening, but in order to placate the activist investor, as well as some other investors who didn't love the fact that Disney was hemorrhaging money in certain regards, you had a bunch of job cuts, right? A bunch of ESPN on-air personalities were cut. Other Disney jobs were let go, I believe 7,000, 8,000 or so from various departments. Pretty big deal. And Iger was able to stave off that, but at the expense of where, the Journal, Wall Street Journal, did a podcast called The Journal on this, where Iger is going around basically, explaining to people this is harder than he thought. He's not, loving this, which is a big deal, because during his first tenure through, I believe it was 2006 through, up until around the pandemic or so. I mean, during his first tenure, Iger was championed as a hero for what he was able to accomplish with Disney. I mean, that was the rise of Disney acquiring several important IP purchases, including Marvel, right? Which led to all the Marvel films and all that. Some of the ideas he got Star Wars, which also was huge for them. I mean, he is hailed as very, very high up there in terms of one of the best CEOs, especially during that first tenure. When he comes back to deal with this mess after he got Chapek kicked out, I mean, he is not loving it. It's much harder than he originally thought. He's had to deal with a lot of fires and things to put out. And he just had his contract extended because he wasn't originally supposed to stay around much longer. He was supposed to kind of take it back from Chapek and then, right the ship and the correction of the ship, but then go right off into the sunset or retire again. Instead, he needs to be signed on for an additional 2 years to hopefully get that done, right? And given the way that linear networks are going, which again was Disney's bread and butter for the longest time with the Disney Channel, with ABC, ESPN, all that stuff. You've got cord cutting. You've got kind of the rise and advent of streaming. Streaming has not been very profitable for very many companies, right? Netflix has been able to make money. They were the first. They were the largest, obviously. But even they have had to, implement password sharing rules and all this other stuff, raise prices. It's getting tougher out there. Spotify is raising prices. Peacock is raising prices. Streaming has turned from, hey, we're just all about infinite subscriber growth. We don't care about profitability to, well, now macroeconomic environment is starting to shift, which again, I've talked about for a long time that this has been coming. And now we need to worry about profitability. So we need to see more profit here. We need to see less loss because the streaming losses that Disney talked about, especially on Chapek's last earnings call, were insane. And a lot of it was coming from ESPN Plus, from Disney Plus, right? Like it's a lot bigger losses than everyone expected. And now there's, especially with rising interest rates being more expensive and harder to borrow debt, it's turning to, we need to make this profitable. We need to make this more profitable, need to cut costs, etc., which was always going to happen. It just was a matter of time. So that kind of sets the stage here. Iger then sits down with CNBC and makes some of these quotes that kind of, again, reinforce what we just talked about. He told David Faber at Allen & Co.'s annual conference in Sun Valley, Idaho, quote, after coming back, I realized the company is facing a lot of challenges, some of them self-inflicted. This article goes on to talk about, at the top of the list, is assessing the traditional TV business. Not a direct quote, but this is what Iger said. Disney owns a portfolio of TV networks from broadcast station ABC to cable Disney TV channels like ESPN. He then goes on to talk about, in this article and interview, quote, we've gotten a lot done very quickly, significant cost reductions and significant realignment of the company, but dealing head on with some of our biggest challenges. And that comes to, that essentially is him talking about like, yeah, we've done a lot of restructuring. We made some dents here, but we have a lot more to go, right? There's some big challenges still coming down the road. He continues to talk about a lot of things, but he essentially says he is okay to sell off ABC. He would look at selling off ABC, which is, a staple of regular linear television. A lot of assets are on the table, including things that were just bought recently. Right. So some of the Fox IP that Disney bought, they'd be looking at selling that. All of this is on the table, but what's not on the table is ESPN. Instead, they're looking for a strategic partner. And Sports Business Journal has talked about this. John Orand has talked about this a fair amount as well. That signals a couple things, right? You're saying you'll get rid of ABC. You're saying you'll get rid of everything is up for sale. Not ESPN though. We want a strategic partner to come in and help with that, but I'm not going to sell ESPN. That shows a commitment to and kind of tips Iger's hand in terms of he believes sports is where streaming profitability lies, right? Or at least is a major part in it. Because ESPN has lost money for a long time now. At one point, there was talk of selling the network. It was one of the first networks that were on the chopping block 3 or 4 years ago, right? When linear was still being eroded, but it wasn't as bad as it is now. You didn't have the pandemic and all of that. ESPN has been talked about being rolled off for a while. It has never been a very profitable entity. However, it is the largest sports powerhouse, media company in the world. It is synonymous with sports. If you think sports, you think ESPN in some form or fashion, at least in America. I mean, obviously internationally, not necessarily, but it is huge when it comes to sports. And Iger is saying, despite all of these losses, despite a ton of our losses in streaming coming from ESPN Plus, it's not up for sale. The best I can do is bring on a strategic partner to sell off, part of it, and they can help us through media distribution or content or what have you, but we still own it. That is Iger basically raising his hand and saying, look, this is the future of streaming that I believe we need to be a part of. So that's important because, again, the UFC was a major, major factor in getting ESPN Plus subscriberships off the ground and growing. And as recently as a year or two ago, we know ESPN was extremely happy with their UFC deal, including the pay-per-view deal, just because of the subscriber growth. Now, obviously, when a lot of that happened, you had Iger kind of one foot out the door, and at least for part of it, right? During the pandemic and all of that, Iger was one foot out the door. Chapek was coming in, all that fun stuff. But it would stand to reason, based on Iger's comments, that if he's talking about ESPN and ESPN Plus, which he said eventually ESPN Linear will be moved to ESPN streaming in some form or fashion. He also talked about that. It would stand to reason that he's a big believer in what the UFC has been able to do for the platform, and he's on board with them, right? If he says, you know what, I'm done with ESPN, or, we need to get new content on ESPN and all that, which it's that a little bit, but he didn't outright say, like, we really need new content, we need to diversify things. No. He said, in not so many words, we need to acquire and follow this, but this is the future, and he's happy to put his chips in there. That's very good news for the UFC in terms of renegotiation, in my opinion, right off the bat. The only potential hiccup is who the strategic partner might be, right? Because that could yield some issues or some harder negotiating down the line, especially given that WWE and the UFC are now wrapped together. And as I said last time, when that reverse Morris trust happened, there's a good chance they'll try and pitch some type of combination of UFC and WWE media rights together to a particular network to sweeten the deal, right? Like, hey, you could have both of these huge shows that aren't the big four American sports and own the rights to them. Like, basically the best thing you can get outside in terms of the sports space that is outside of NFL, MLB, NBA, NHL, right? You can get those together so you can dominate that piece of the pie if you are willing to pay us, etc. Right? It's not a bad pitch at all, especially if you're trying to get a leg up in the streaming wars. And you've seen, especially wrestling right now is red hot. It's red hot. Wrestling ratings have been going up for WWE and have kind of bounced back for AEW even a little bit too. It is a good time to be a media company showing wrestling. it's a good time to have that in your distribution list. So wouldn't be surprised if, they push hard for a joint deal or some kind of, close to joint deal, because obviously the rights come up at a little bit different times. But you could obviously talk about and structure it many different ways, and bundling them together. But back to Iger and Disney, right? The strategic partner here could end up being a name that's been floating around is Comcast. Now, Comcast owns Peacock and is currently the owner of WWE media rights, right? That's a very big deal. Like all of the PLE events, premium live events, what they call it, not pay-per-views per se, but similar, whatever, are through Peacock. All the big events, old shows you're able to watch old episodes of shows on Peacock. That's huge. That's huge that's already in place, and that Comcast is a potential suitor for being strategically involved in ESPN. Let's say this deal goes down. Let's say Comcast is a part of it, which again, Disney and Comcast have already done a deal with Hulu, which hasn't yielded the results they necessarily wanted. There's been a little bit back and forth there that might sour the relationship to doing that. But let's say that does happen, and that this is kind of a bargaining chip in the Hulu wars, which is a whole separate conversation about where that's going to go. But if you get Comcast to be part of ESPN, that might allow Comcast to use that to their advantage and Disney to their advantage to negotiating with the UFC and WWE media rights, right? Well, hey, we're going to offer you this price for UFC and being on ESPN, but make sure, right, that if we end up with WWE or we are going to be bidding on WWE, could be a factor. If you don't give us a good deal here, maybe we don't put in as nice a bid for WWE, right? Or vice versa. It gives them a little bit more consolidated negotiating power. Not a ton, mind you. The leverage is still, I believe, on the WWE UFC side, especially since these media companies are needing to be more profitable. Both WWE and UFC are already profitable. And as I just mentioned, WWE ratings are trending up. And UFC is still as big as ever. But it gives them a little bit more to discuss at the negotiation table, right? And might strengthen their bid to get both of them, which I'm sure UFC and WWE would love, right? I can't imagine if Comcast becomes this strategic partner with Disney, that doesn't just make it more likely that you've got UFC, WWE all together on either Comcast or ESPN or some crossover, right? Because the other thing that I've talked about a little bit is you want to have crossover between the two. You're going to have more WWE stars probably show up at UFC events and UFC stars at WWE, vice versa. You're going to have more synergistic opportunities to do something like a show that's like WWE stars training and then fighting in the cage, or UFC stars doing more, matches, like especially the athletic ones that can do matches. That happens all the time. You've got Logan Paul over there right now. You've had Floyd Mayweather do the Big Show spot forever ago. I mean, I guess that's not UFC guys, but you get my point. It would not be hard or unrealistic to see Conor McGregor go do an angle in the WWE, right? Or do a match here and there. Of course not. So if you've got Comcast involved in ESPN as well, that just makes all of these entities closer knit, especially since Disney and Comcast already have a joint deal on Hulu. It just makes it more likely, in my opinion, that the Endeavor, UFC, WWE, Nick Khan, Comcast Bob Iger, Disney show all gets more and more consolidated. Makes it more likely that those go back to where they are and get renewed at Comcast and at ESPN, would be my guess. Now, let's say it's a different partner, right? Because Comcast has definitely been mentioned, but not the only one. There's been talk about private equity. KKR has been mentioned, which would be great for the UFC because they already have been involved with the UFC in a past life. So that familiarity can't be bad. There's been talk about betting sites like DraftKings, FanDuel, things like that. Like, I mean, again, probably could only help the UFC's case because of the massive sponsorship deal that's already happening in the UFC that, you know, whether that's increased sponsorship or a higher, you know, deal offered in negotiation because they want to keep that sponsorship, right, only helps the UFC. But there's also been mention of other tech companies. We've seen Apple go all in with MLS. We've seen Amazon make a deal with one and really want to get into the MMA space, right? May make a bid of their own at UFC rights once they come due. I mean, there's a lot of different opportunities and potential players that could get involved that may actually make it less likely ESPN will aggressively go after UFC rights, especially if it's a different PE firm than KKR. That's really all about the classic private equity. Let's gut and make this as profitable as fast as possible. Because again, the macro environment has changed enough now. We're in a space where, you know, earnings don't look that great. Streaming needs to be more profitable. Interest rates are still rising. People are still talking about a recession, et cetera. Yeah, who knows when that's going to hit. But it's going to be harder for the UFC to get that double rights deal that they've been talking about getting in all these international deals, right? That's what they want. But going to be much harder, especially if you've got somebody coming in essentially being the accounting parent to Disney saying like, yes, Bob, we know you want to, you know, go after these UFC rights again. They've been crucial to ESPN Plus, et cetera, but it's going to cost a lot of money and we're really all about making it profitable, right? If that's their main goal, that's going to hurt the UFC's chances of getting as much money as they want, at least from ESPN. Will somebody else give them the money they want? Quite possibly, but you want every buyer to give you the highest possible bid, right? The more buyers you have throwing high money at you, the better it is for you. And obviously, Dana's been happy about the ESPN deal. Endeavor has been thrilled about it. Makes a ton of sense that if ESPN and Disney is one of the higher, bidding companies, you would want to stay with them just because you know that works already. You know the synergies are there. You know that Disney has only really interfered during the time when Iger had to make a call to Dana or to Ari, who then had to make a call to Dana about, you know, hosting an event during the pandemic and all that stuff in California. But, you know, for the most part, that relationship has been very, very good. And if you know it works, why would you mess with it? Especially if they're one of the top bidders. Now, is there a particular dollar amount where that doesn't matter? Of course. But I mean, if you've got somebody offering you a couple million more, just a couple, than the deal you could get with Disney, and that couple million more is, you know, with somebody who you're not really sure that you want to deal with, or might have different logistical issues, or who knows how the partnership will work out. Well, you might end up choosing Disney anyway. So you want that high bid from your already established partner because you know what works already with them. But if they get a strategic partner who, again, Disney should be able to override them and all that, but you never want anybody who has a large amount of shares or is you're bringing on specifically to help finance what you believe is the future of streaming. You do not want to upset them, right? I would imagine if it came down to it between Iger choosing between Endeavor and Dana versus their strategic partner, they're going to lean more their strategic partner just because of the broader implications, right? There's been NFL and NBA have been thrown around as these strategic partners as well. I mean, you do not want to upset those guys if that's who you end up going with. So it's all going to come down to who Iger picks in terms of if it will help or hurt the UFC at the negotiation table. PFL, I don't think it's going to affect really that much at all. Might, right? Again, if you got the bean counter as your strategic partner, going to be harder for PFL to get a better deal. Otherwise, I'd imagine just for the content sake and the price, they're probably fine with it. Hard to say, but again, not as high stakes, right? With the UFC deal, it's going to be interesting. It's going to be very, very interesting depending on who they bring in. Right now, Comcast or private equity seems like the best call and seems like the front runners. But you never know. There are multiple people wanting to be in on this, right? That's the big thing. Is it's not just Iger says, "Hey, we were looking for a strategic partner," and nobody's picking up the phone and calling. A lot of people are. So it'll be kind of up to Iger to decide, and Disney as a whole to decide. Jimmy Paterno as well, the president of ESPN, are part of these conversations. They'll decide who to bring in, but it will impact the UFC media negotiations. It has to. And moving forward, with ESPN being clearly a centerpiece of Iger's vision of where Disney goes from here, it's going to be another new party entered into the dynamic between Endeavor, UFC, Disney, ESPN, all of that. Maybe it's a familiar face like KKR. Great. Makes it a lot easier. But maybe it's someone who has their own ideas, own thoughts on certain things. You never know with this stuff, right? You really never know. So I think Comcast is especially if it's parlayed into something to do with the Hulu deal, which they're currently trying to figure out. I think Comcast is the best bet. But other than that, I can't say. There's too many variables right now. I don't necessarily think it's a betting company, like DraftKings or any of that. I don't think now's the time for that. Iger didn't really hint at that too much, but I don't know. Let me know who you think might end up being ESPN's strategic partner and who would be best or worst for the UFC media rights negotiations. Curious to hear your thoughts on this, because I mean, it's an interesting time, and the macroeconomic environment's only going to get wilder, folks. So buckle up. All right, we're going to be very quick with quick hits just to keep things moving. But a couple of things I wanted to call out. PFL is partnering with USADA moving forward, trying to work out a deal so that they have regular testing for their athletes. I think it's a good call. I mean, USADA is obviously more expensive than what they were doing before, I'm sure. But given all of the positive drug tests, I think that's the best move PFL can make right now, just for their brand, their imaging, to make sure they don't have another fiasco with their season just being completely upended by failed drug tests. I mean, if you look at the PFL season at the start, what was announced versus where we are now, it's just something else, right? I don't think it's hurt PFL branding too much, right? But going forward, if they're looking for growth, especially with all the press from Ngannou and all that stuff, that helped them a lot too, right? That signing was huge for them. But they've got to fix this. And I think hiring USADA is probably their best bet in what they can do for short and long term, providing the costs are worth it. And in this case, given all those failures, I think it probably is. So I think it's a good call. Other thing to call out is that Michael Venom Page is a restricted free agent, I guess. They're still in the matching period technically, but was shown at UFC London, which kind of hints that he may be going to the UFC and it's a done deal. Hard to know for sure, right? But it usually, if somebody's showing on screen, probably a good bet. That's where they're most likely going, right? Not all the time, but I mean, hard to look at that and not think that might be what's happening. Then again, you had Clarissa Shields at a UFC event, UFC 245, where it sounded like she might fight Nunes sometime, and she went to PFL, right? I mean, negotiations are still ongoing, but does he land back at Bellator? Does he go to, I don't know. I think it makes sense for him to go to the UFC, but we'll see. Just an interesting side note is him being a free agent and being shown on the UFC screen. Last quick hit is, we're not going to talk about it on this episode. I need to dig deeper into it, but there is some movement on the PFL Bellator stuff, some big movement. So I will get back with you probably next week or the week after. I need a lot more digging on it and have just now started to have the time to do that. But expect some interesting stories coming out with the PFL and Bellator would be my guess. When or how long, I'm not sure. But yeah, I'll fill you guys in when I can. Those are the quick hits. Let me know if I missed anything. I know we've been gone for a couple of weeks, so if I missed anything you think was a big business call, let me know. A couple of other small dealers here and there, but I thought those were the most prominent for right now, especially given their recency. All right, last thing we're going to talk about today is Dana White's appearance on the Forbes Sportsmoney podcast. So he was asked about the future of the UFC, his power slap strategy moving forward, etc. We're not going to talk about the power slap stuff because, again, I don't think it's really warranted too much. He mostly talked about social media being the main driver of that. Where we will circle back to that is the future of the UFC and where White, I think, is kind of viewing strategy for the promotion, especially given all the changes going on, right? So in this interview, White talks about, ideas he's had, things that they're doing, how the UFC has gone all over the world where boxing didn't really, do that, which is true. I mean, the UFC did an amazing job breaking into markets worldwide. Boxing had that, right? You had the Thriller in Manila. You had, a bunch of fights that were in other places outside of America. But it was not as, again, given the rise of the Ali Act and everything else going on too, right? It was not the same level of what the UFC was able to accomplish in terms of entering new markets and successfully converting fans to be UFC fans, not necessarily MMA fans, but UFC fans. He also, in this, there are graphics that talk about current valuation of UFC at 12 billion, revenue for 2022 at 1.1 billion, and operating costs, or EBITDA, at around 600 million, which is around what we've known, right? In terms of the reporting from John Nash, some Endeavor financial filings. The 12.1 billion, again, valuation is always debatable, per usual, but it's not that far off, right? Compared to the revenue they're bringing in and everything. I mean, it's not a terrible valuation, in my opinion. It's not so far-fetched that, you balk at it anymore, because they're bringing in $1 billion in revenue every year and 600 EBITDA, 600 million EBITDA. I mean, that's massive. They still have a lot of debt, but they're paying it down and making payments on that. They had the Reverse Morris Trust, which I think, again, was a great idea, especially combining with WWE. They're worth a lot of money. The other key piece graphic that was really shown, because, again, there were more about the UFC's reach in 2022, all that fun stuff. But the other key graphic, in my opinion, without a doubt, is UFC revenue sources, which, again, it's Forbes. So I'm not going to say Forbes is an unreliable source, because that's not true. But some of their listings of monetary value from certain people and things before it has, their Forbes money lists and 30 under $30. Sometimes you're scratching your head, like, is it really? Like, where are you taking some of this at face value from what people say? But that being said, if we're assuming this graphic is correct, which you have UFC revenue sources, they've listed media at 781 million, which is 71% of their revenue. Sponsorships at 143 million, which is 13%. Live events, 121 million at 11%, and then consumer products at 55 million, which is 5%. Sounds about right-ish, right? Based on what we know. And based on Endeavor's financial filings. But that highlight and that graphic, again, is great to represent just how little the fans actually matter to their revenue. I cannot stress this enough. You look at this graphic and you realize very quickly how little fans actually matter right now to UFC revenue. I'll say it one more time to drive the point home. The fans are very insignificant to UFC's current revenue model. The reason I keep driving this home is you have people complaining about cards, saying, what are you going to do about the fans? Like, this is the fight the fans want to see, etc. And that's kind of the company line that Dana touts as a promoter, as he should. He says in this interview that all the cards are stacked, all that. When, if you watch the past couple fight night cards, that's not necessarily the case. But there is so little incentive for them to make changes right now that they could put on Silva versus Holm fight night cards for the rest of the year. And fans would, of course, bitch and moan and say, I'm not watching that, blah, blah, blah. It wouldn't affect them in the slightest in the short term. It would not. Could it hypothetically affect their media rights deal if all of a sudden ratings plunged off a cliff? Yeah. Would ratings plunge off a cliff, though? That's the real question, right? You have such a hardcore fan base. I don't know how many fans I saw complaining about, this is a terrible fight night card, this sucks. And then at the same time, have a bunch of fans say, no, well, that was still exciting. These are the cards. What is that anecdotal BS of, the ones where you don't know anybody are the most exciting ones? Like, maybe. I mean, sometimes, right? You do have a lot of fights that hopefully finish inside the distance or are favored to finish inside the distance, but I don't know if they're always the best. But you've got this diehard group of fans that will just continually watch these cards without fail. And why would they be incentivized to change it and make it more exciting, to raise their fighter costs, right? Which is, I think, 13% or whatever was last talked about. But I mean, would raise their fighter costs essentially to why would they be incentivized to do that when 84% of their revenue comes from sponsorships and media? If their live events drop, right? People buy less tickets. They're like, I'm not going to go see that, blah, blah, blah. Drop, by even cut in half, right? That's 5% of their revenue gone. They don't want that, but they could give a crap about the fans right now. They are extremely focused on making the sponsors happy and making whoever's going to buy their media rights next happy. They're focused on making sure their numbers are up or good enough for ESPN and for potential suitors when the media rights deal is up. And they are focused on making sponsors happy and making sure that they get their logos and signing new sponsors and all of that. They could give a flying about the fans. Why would they? And sorry if I did curse. It's been a long day. I probably did, but yeah, it just they're it's not going to be the focus, guys. It's you can complain, be upset, whatever. It's not. They follow the numbers. Here are the numbers. I cannot drive this home enough. Fans aren't that important. And I know a bunch of you are like, well, if people stop watching, then their media deal is not going to be as much. It's like, well, yes, again, if enough fans altogether stop watching, if they really make the product that terrible and throw it off a cliff, yes, then it's going to affect their big chunk of revenue for media, it's going to be a huge deal. But they almost certainly won't do that, A. And B, they don't have to do that to still make changes where, yeah, you might lose a few fans here or a few fans there, blah, blah, blah. But ultimately, you keep the majority of them, and they're fine with that. Because you're still going to have the occasional stacked card no matter what, right? They're not stupid enough to make every card Bueno Silva versus Holm. I mean, 291 coming up this weekend, stacked to the brim, at least as of this recording. Yeah, they're still going to do that. So you're still going to get big pay-per-views, all that stuff. But you can put on a lot more fight night cards at the apex where you have 1 or 2 name fighters and the rest are all Dana White Contender Series fighters, and you save money on fighter costs. And as long, again, as you're not doing that for pay-per-views and every single fight card, you're fine. Even if you did, again, I don't know how much it would truly affect viewership in some ways. And they could literally do that and just make Dana White Contender Series the actual events for pay-per-views, at least for the next year, right? They're set. That money is fixed. So they could completely throw things out the window and make it terrible. They're still making money hand over fist for 2023. Because it's fixed revenue. I cannot stress enough. People are talking about rising ticket price. Yeah, I agree. Ticket prices are through the roof. But fans make up so little of their revenue. And keep in mind, when they sign a new media rights deal, which will be for 1.5 to 2 times what they're getting now, hopefully in their minds, and if it's for 5, 6 years, whatever, like they're going to carry even less. That's why I'm saying get ready to see more Apex shows, get ready to see less 291s, all of that stuff. I'm sure they'll go out for UFC 300. That actually lines up perfectly for when they're in that negotiating period. So next year, I bet we get some awesome cards. Mark my words. Next year, I bet we get a bunch of awesome pay-per-view cards, especially around certain Q2 quarter end type stuff. But overall, I mean, this graphic tells it all, man. It's just not. And Dana White goes on to talk about it. He says, we're going to keep doing what we're doing. Look to, make sure we're doing blah, blah, blah. Yeah, they're going to keep doing this. That's their whole plan. I can't say it enough, guys. And so the rest of this interview, moving on from that, is, him talking about, again, the future of the UFC, where he says in vague stuff, but they're promoting the best fights. They're doing all this, blah, blah, blah. It kind of goes on again in vague generalities in a lot of ways. Then he talks about Power Slap. And again, we don't care much about Power Slap on this show, but one key thing that he talked about is social media being a huge driver of it. And that being the thing that kind of clicked him to be, oh, okay, like we're going to go after Power Slap because I'm seeing the numbers on social media. It's interesting. It's something we can grow off of, blah, blah, blah. And yes, in terms of linear TV, it did terrible. I still know a lot of people that are like, no way am I watching this. But the fighter costs are almost non-existent, right? These guys are getting paid just a couple grand, which is nothing and crazy. And they are getting a lot of social media views on a younger skewed audience. So it's not unreasonable for White to look at this as a new potential product, right? If we're talking about product, service, whatever you want to call it, this is a new potential product. Is it blowing the doors, banging everything out? Not necessarily, no. Right? It's not like there's been a ton of sponsorships, not like, you had it on TNT and then it obviously did not go well, did not get renewed. In that regard, you're not getting big names and all that stuff. But that doesn't mean there isn't an audience for it and there isn't a way for them to make money off of it. And social media, again, if the numbers are doing extremely well. So it's hard to look at those numbers and be like, well, okay, it's not, because that advertisers will love some of their numbers, especially in this graphic. They talk about doing more views than, the Heat during the during the NBA finals and the NHL and all this stuff. I mean, there are certain advertisers that are going to be eating that up all day, and sponsors that will pay them to do it. They could be on Rumble and everybody could say they're the laughing stock of the combat world and whatever. Doesn't matter, because they could get a bunch of money from advertisers to make it profitable because their costs are so low. And the fact that that's the type of stuff that White is focused on in Power Slap, he's going to translate that same mindset over to the UFC, right? You're going to look to blow up stars through social media. Social media has to be a critical metric for UFC views. And he's hinted on that. Again, Chase Hooper, a couple other people, Raul Rosas Jr., I think, that's a critical metric they use about who they push and stuff like that. It's just going to keep going. It's not going to end. The future of the UFC is cutting costs, pushing people that hit the right social media metrics, and making as much money as possible through media and sponsorship deals. That's what I get from this interview, and that's what I get from everything I'm seeing. Tell me if I'm wrong. I would love to hear somebody disagree and give me better points on it, but I don't know how else it is. Fan service is gone. Wait until that new media rights deal is gone. Next year is going to be an awesome year for pay-per-views and cards. The following year, when that deal is inked, it's going to suck, I bet. That's my call. I hope I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong, but that's what I'm predicting at this point. Let me know your thoughts on all of this. It's, we're in that phase, and especially as the macroeconomic environment gets worse, if a recession hits, that's a whole nother thing. But let me know your thoughts on if you think I'm right in this prediction, if you think that, any of this surprised you from the revenue sources. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on all that. All right, guys, and that wraps up another episode of the Fight Business Podcast. Thank you so much for listening, watching. If you're on YouTube, like, subscribe. If you're listening on Stitcher, Spotify, what have you, always love and appreciate you guys. Feel free to give any comments on this stuff. Again, love to hear feedback here on either the Fury and Ngannou stuff, the Disney stuff, especially. That's where I really nerd out, obviously, because I talked about it for 30 minutes. The UFC revenue stuff, any of that. Should be back more regularly. Again, I'm not going to commit to anything because every time I do, it's always a problem, but expect to see more of me. So throw any topics you want me to cover out at me. Now is the time to do that for sure. And with that in mind, until next time, y'all, get money.